So, this week I was in Sacramento for a leadership conference. And I got back to Denver on Wednesday evening, and by the time I got home, it was late in the evening. And Tammy and I put the girls to bed together, and then we stayed up talking for a while. And she said, since you were gone, I caught up on the news, and I just can't figure out why this is happening. And how can people walk into a restaurant with an AK-47 and open fire? How can people walk into a concert hall and open fire on innocent people? What's behind this? How does this happen? And she said, while you were gone on the news, they kept playing this video by some of the ISIS leaders. And these leaders were saying they're going to come and do similar attacks here in America on our major cities. And she says, when you were gone and I was putting the kids down for bed, I had this fear come over me and this unsettled feeling. And you want to say something brilliant, you want to be strong, but you also know that you're asking the exact same questions. And then earlier that day, I get an email from a friend. And she was asking my thoughts on the Syrian refugee crisis. And she was asking good, honest questions. And she said, my first impulse is to say, no, of course we can't let people in. This is the time we have to protect ourselves and look out for ourselves. But then she said, there's this whole Jesus thing. And doesn't it seem like Jesus would have responded exactly opposite? And didn't Jesus live in opposite ways of welcoming the stranger, extending hospitality? What are we to do? How do we live faithfully to the gospel of Jesus Christ? How do we live faithfully to the good news? And I hope that's a question we're all struggling with. I hope that's one we can wrestle with together. And then on Friday night, just 2 nights ago, we had company over, one of whom was a 19-year-old college student. And some of the first words out of her mouth were words of fear. Fear of terrorism and fear to go new places and do new things. I don't know about you all, but I found myself in several of these kinds of conversations just over the course of the week. And it leads me to believe that fear and anxiety may be the big monsters that we face in our day. So let's confront the monsters, shall we? N.T. Wright is a biblical scholar. He's done a lot of work in Luke Acts, and he defines the mission of the church like this, and I love the way he defines it. I think it's simple, and I think it jives so much with what we've been doing. If we can have that slide. The mission of the church is to go to the place where we are sent, which again and again will be the place where there are other powers at work, and to announce and embody the power of Jesus in that place, to announce good news in that place, to speak salvation in the middle of the storm. So what we'll do this morning is explore this mission through the eyes of Paul at the end of Acts, where Paul finds himself on a ship sailing to Rome. He's on the ship with about 275 other people, most of whom are prisoners, and they have encountered some major storms and shipwreck on the sea. And I happen to think this story is incredibly relevant for us today. But before we just jump into Acts chapter 27, I always feel like with Acts, there's so much backstory going on, so let's just look at the backstory for just a moment. Paul has again been arrested. Nothing new for Paul. We saw this last week. He and Silas spent time in prison. Paul has been arrested. He's again brought before the legal authorities. This time he's brought before King Agrippa and King Agrippa's sidekick named Festus. And Paul is appealing his innocence. He's appealing his case, and at one point in the story, Paul gets so frustrated, he says, I'm done with you all, forget it. Bring me to Caesar, bring me to the Roman emperor, and I will appeal my case there in Rome. At this point in the story, King Agrippa looks over at Festus, and Paul is next to him, and he says to Festus, what an idiot. man, we would have let this guy go because there's nothing we can hold him on. He hasn't really broken any laws. We may not like him, but we can't hold him for that reason alone. Had he not appealed to Caesar, he would be set free. You see, first century Roman law says once you start the appeal process to Caesar, you can't backtrack on it. You can't go backwards. The only way is to keep going forward. So they put Paul on a ship with lots and lots of other prisoners, and they send him to Rome. If I can have the map slide, please. So I always like to give you all some perspective of where we're at in Acts. This map is actually kind of cool because it shows you Paul's journey. There's Jerusalem to give some perspective. Chapters 27, early chapter 27, and here they landed there for a bit. Then they went back out later in chapter 7. They're somewhere right in here, lost at storm at sea. And then they actually land at this island called Malta, which is at the end of the story. And then from there they travel into Rome. Acts chapter 28. You'll have to read that on your own. So here's how the story goes. They're on this ship, and they've been on this ship for 14 days now, and they've encountered major storms. And here's what happens. Let's read it together. On the 14th night, we were being carried across the Adriatic Sea. Around midnight, hint, hint, remember this from last week. When you see this in the scriptures, around midnight, or it can also be translated in the middle of the night, it is the storyteller giving you a major heads up. Something important, something significant is about to happen. You don't want to miss it. God is on the move. Something big is happening. So in the middle of the night, the sailors began to suspect that land was near. They dropped a weighted line to take soundings and found the water to be about 120 feet deep. After proceeding a little farther, we took soundings again and found the water to be about 90 feet deep. Afraid that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they hurled out 4 anchors from the stern and began to pray for daylight. The sailors tried to abandon the ship by lowering the lifeboat into the sea, pretending they were going to lower anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and his soldiers, "Unless they stay in the ship, you can't be saved from peril." The soldiers then cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before daybreak, Paul urged everyone to eat. He said, "This is the 14th day you've lived in suspense, and you've not even had a bite to eat. I urge you to take some food. Your health depends on it. None of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God in front of them all, then broke it and began to eat. Everyone was encouraged and took some food. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. And if we were to continue reading this story, we would see that then they gather up the strength to cut the anchors loose. And they start drifting towards shore, and some of them jump out, and they all make it safely to shore together. So, what's the big thing happening in this story? What's the big thing? Around midnight, or in the middle of the night, Paul takes this bread, and he breaks this bread. And he gives thanks to God in front of all of them, in front of everyone on the ship. And then they share this meal together and they eat as much as they want. Why is this such a big thing? History. You see, in that time and in that day, if things were to go poorly in your life, it was because the gods were against you. And you hadn't sacrificed enough. You hadn't acknowledged the gods enough. So this was their form of sending punishment. If you were a sailor and storms came on the sea and you found yourself in this situation, you hadn't made the right decisions. You hadn't taken the right steps. You hadn't sacrificed enough. And it wasn't just on a sea. This was in all aspects of their life. Like if the rains were falling on your fields and a good crop came that season, it was because the gods were pleased with you. You had done enough. You had sacrificed and prayed and acknowledged him enough. But say like your kid got sick and the gods were angry with you. You didn't sacrifice enough. You didn't acknowledge enough. And what is Paul doing here? I mean, you can see how religion can step in and create all sorts of anxiety for people, right? When you never really know where you stand with God. Is God for you? Is God against you? Have you done enough? Have you done too much? Have you sinned too much? Have you done too little? And Paul, what does he do? Breaks the bread, holds it up, give thanks. They eat together. And can't you hear Paul saying, hey guys, you don't have to live with all this anxiety. You truly can live and love. Everything you thought you should do has already been done for you. God's favor has already been extended to you exactly where you are. There's nothing more you can do to earn it. Do you see why this is good news? And by the way, you would never offer thanks during the raging storm. It'd be making a mockery of the gods. This is the time to sacrifice. Remember the story of Jonah. Jonah was on the ship. He was supposed to go to Nineveh, but he got on the wrong boat on purpose. And the storms come. And people on the ship, they go downstairs and they wake Jonah up and they say, Jonah, why are the gods angry? What have you done? And he says, yep, you're right. Let me sacrifice myself and jump off the boat. And that's what he does. And then a whale swallows him up, and you know the rest of the story. What Paul is doing here is responding with the deepest kind of love, the deepest form of community. And here's the other kicker in the story. Paul wasn't afraid of these prisoners, right? These 200 plus prisoners. He breaks the bread and eats with them and says, this grace is for you too. And let's be honest, these prisoners, they could have been murderers and thieves and terrorists. And Paul says, this grace is for you too. Why would Paul proclaim such a God of grace? Paul knew his story, not just his story, but he knew the story of his people, his ancient ancestors. Paul, in another place in the New Testament, in this book called Philippians, where he's writing a letter to the church in Philippi, he describes himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews, a good Jew, a well-educated Jew. He would have been profoundly shaped and formed by their foundational story, which is the story of the Exodus. You remember it? The ancient Israelites are held captive in Egypt. They're slaves. They're being oppressed. They're suffering. God sends Moses to liberate them. Why? It wasn't because they did something so great or they worked up some sort of ladder and earned God's favor. The text says, because God heard their cries, God sent rescue. Paul would have known the stories of God always standing with those who suffer, those who are oppressed, those who have been beaten, those who have been kicked around, the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And Paul would have known his own story of grace. Not long ago, he was the one persecuting Jesus' followers. Now he's a Jesus follower creating other Jesus followers. And how does he describe his experience? Man, I was walking to Damascus doing my thing, looking for other Jesus followers, and I was blinded and then I saw the light. It wasn't anything great that he did, but it was because of God's grace he was able to see. Can you see why it's good news? Good news then, good news now. It's a God who's interested in restoring, not destroying. A God who's interested in new life. It's the God of grace, the God of love, the God of what we might call restorative justice. Now, if I'm being honest with you, there are times that I still cling to a God who works in the system of punishment and reward. A God who punishes those who are bad and a God who rewards those who are good. And if we're honest, most of us here in this room at least, since we're in Western civilization, we have been well educated not in restorative justice, but retributive justice. And we see this everywhere. We see it in the legal system. We see it in the penal system. We see it in our theologies. And this is a system that says you get what you deserve. People get what they deserve. And it makes sense to most of us. To most of us, we agree with this system. But it's so different from the gospel. It is so different from the good news because people actually get better. Every time people get better than what they deserve. It's the way grace works. And for so many of us, we grew up with this notion of hell and purgatory. And in the same breath we say, yeah, it's about loving God. And I just have to ask you, how does that cause you to love God? It might cause you to fear God, but I've never seen it cause people to love God. If loving God is the goal, I've never seen that happen. I have a friend who's always talking about God as a parent, which I actually really love this metaphor. He says God's like the parent, and we just want to please this God, just like we want to please our parents because we want our parents to be proud of us, and we want God to be proud of us, and it sounds like so much work. And it's where his metaphor starts breaking down for me because I start thinking, dude, there is nothing you can do to get God to love you more. There's nothing you can do to earn more of his favor. It's already with you. God is already on your side. God is already with you. Parents in the room, is it true? Is there anything I could say to you, standing up here, is there anything I could say to you to get you to love your kids more? You love them because they're your kids. Like even when they're breaking your heart and doing really dumb things, you still love them because they're yours. We have to really ask the question, what kind of God do we serve? Do we believe that God is going around waiting to crush some, waiting to punish some, waiting to reward others? Or do we believe that God is seeking to transform the world, to transform human hearts through the means of love and grace? And if I'm honest, I like to see people get punished. If I'm honest, I like to see terrorists burn in hell. And if I'm honest, I like to see people rot in prison. And if I'm honest, there are days when I close my heart because I just can't trust the world. And oh, how different it is from the way of God. The one who always responds in grace, the one who is seeking to transform the world through love. Richard Rohr, one of my favorite theologians, he says this, if I can have the next slide. We think fear and anger and judgment and punishment are going to achieve love. Show me where. Do you remember your story? Can you look at yourself and truly say, but by the grace of God, there go I? Do you remember the grace that has been extended to you? Because when you remember this kind of grace, it's easier and more natural to extend grace to others. And fear, the thing about fear is it's a lot like the sea. It can be a great gift, but it can also wreak havoc. See, if you're out in the wilderness and you encounter a lion and you turn and run, well, fear has probably just saved your life. But the thing is, if you live in this kind of fear, if you live in the confinements of fear and anxiety, if it's controlling all the decisions you make in life, if it's controlling the places you go and the people you welcome, then it's not really a gift, is it? It has stopped being a gift. When we live in fear and anxiety, it never brings us closer to God. It never creates communitas. It doesn't draw us closer together. It usually makes us less gracious, more judgmental. We becoming really good at determining who's in and who's out, who's really deserving of God's grace and who's not deserving. And my friends, the gospel, the good news is so much better than that. So let me close with asking you this question. In the midst of the raging storm, in the midst of all the fear and anxiety, in the midst of terrorist attacks, in the midst of not knowing what's next, what kind of God are we encountering? And what kind of God are we proclaiming together?